Hello, BookTube, and happy Victober to you all. It is October 1st, and we are going to read a book together. It's been too long. We are going to read Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope, published in 2 volumes in 1864, squarely in the middle of the Victorian era. And we are going to start with Chapter 1. You'll pardon me, I've got my battered reading copy here. Again, like with that Dover paperback, I don't know if this will survive. And I have my Pluto bookmark. Never forget. And we are on Chapter 1. God help us all. Of this Chapter 1 of this gigantic 1,000-page novel. The chapter is titled Mr. Vavasor and His Daughter, where we are going to be introduced to the her of the title, Can You Forgive Her? I think I can guess, even now, who knows how many months before we finish this thing, whether or not any of you can forgive her. But we have a long way to go, so let's see. Whether or no she, whom you are to forgive, if you can, did or did not belong to the upper 10,000 of this our English world, I am not prepared to say with any strength of affirmation. The upper 10,000 here being the most wealthy people, the landed aristocracy, the big people, as they're going to be called. By blood, she was connected with big people, distantly connected with some very big people indeed, people who belonged to the upper 1,000, if there will be such any such division. So not just 10,000, but 1,000. Really big people. But of these very big relations, she had known and seen little, and they had cared as little for her. Her grandfather, Squire Vavasor of Vavasor Hall in Westmoreland, was a country gentleman possessing some 1,000 a year at the outside, and he therefore never came up to London, and had no ambition to have himself numbered as one of any exclusive set. He's a classic country gentleman of the Trollope mold. A hot-headed, ignorant, honest old gentleman, he lived ever at Vavasor Hall, declaring to any who would listen to him that the country was going to the mischief, and congratulated himself, at any rate, in his country, parliamentary reform had been as powerless to alter the old political arrangements. Alice Vavasor, whose offence against the world I am to tell you, and if possible to excuse, was the daughter of his younger son, and as her father, John Vavasor, had done nothing to raise the family name to eminence, Alice could not lay claim to any high position from her birth as a Vavasor. John Vavasor had come up to London early in life as a barrister, and had failed. He had failed at least in attaining either much wealth or much repute, though he had succeeded in earning, or perhaps I might better say in obtaining, a livelihood. He had married a lady somewhat older than himself, who was in possession of 400 a year, and who was related to those big people to whom I have alluded. Who these were, and the special nature of the relationship, I shall be called upon to explain hereafter. But at present it will suffice to say that Alice MacLeod gave great offence to all her friends by her marriage. That is the wife of Alice Vavasor. She did not, however, give them much time for the indulgence of their anger. Having given birth to a daughter within 12 months of her marriage, she died, leaving in abeyance that question as to whether the fault of her marriage should or should not be pardoned by her family. When a man marries an heiress for her money, if that money be within her own control, as was the case with Miss MacLeod's fortune, it is generally well for the speculating lover that the lady's friend should quarrel with him and with her. She is thereby driven to throw herself entirely into the gentleman's arms, and he thus becomes possessed of the wife and the money without the abominable nuisance of stringent settlements. But the MacLeods, though they quarrelled with Alice, did not quarrel with her outright. They snubbed herself and her chosen husband, but they did not go so far as to separate themselves from her, and her affairs as to give up the charge of her possessions. Her 400 a year was settled very closely on herself and her children, and without even a life interest having been given to Mr. Vavasor, and therefore when she died the mother's fortune became the property of the little baby. But under these circumstances, the big people did not refuse to interest themselves to some extent on the behalf of the father. I do not suppose that any actual agreement or compact was made between Mr. Vavasor and the MacLeods, but it came to be understood between them that if he made no demand upon them as to his daughter's money, and allowed them to have the charge of her education, they would do something for it. He was a practicing barrister, though his practice had never amounted to much, and a practicing barrister is always supposed to be capable of filling any situation which may come in his way. 2 years after his wife's death, Mr. Vavasor was appointed assistant commissioner in some office which had to do with insolvents, and which was abolished 3 years after his appointment. It was at first thought that he would keep his 800 a year for life and be required to do nothing for it. But a wretched cheese-paring Whig government, as John Vavasor called it when describing the circumstances of the arrangement to his father in Westmoreland, would not permit this. It gave him the option of taking 400 a year for doing nothing, or keeping his whole income and attending 3 days a week for 3 hours a day during the term, at a miserable, dingy little office near Chancery Lane, where his duty would consist in signing his name to accounts which he never read and at which he was never supposed even to look. He sulkily elected to keep the money. And this signing has now been for nearly 20 years the business of his life. Of course, he considered himself to be a very hardly used man. One Lord Chancellor after another he petitioned, begging that he might be relieved from the cruelty of his position and allowed to take his salary without doing anything in return for it. The amount of work which he did perform was certainly the minimum of labor. Term time, as terms were counted in Mr. Vavasor's office, hardly comprised half the year, and the hours of weekly attendance did not do more than make 1 day's work a week for a working man. But Mr. Vavasor had been appointed as an assistant commissioner, and with every Lord Chancellor he argued that all Westminster Hall and Lincoln's Inn to boot had no right to call upon him to degrade himself by signing his name to accounts. In answer to every memorial, he was offered the alternative of freedom with half his income, and so the thing went on. We're striking a high comic note here, because this guy loses his job but expects to keep his money. Expects to get 800 a year for doing literally nothing at all. And when he's offered 400 a year for doing nothing at all, he won't do it. He wants the 800, even though he means he's going to have to go to the salt mines. There can, however, be no doubt that Mr. Vavasor was better off and happier with his almost nominal employment than he would have been without it. He always argued that it kept him in London, but he would undoubtedly have lived in London with or without his official occupation. He had become so habituated to London life in a small way, before the choice of leaving London was open to him, that nothing would have kept him away from it for long. After his wife's death, he dined at his club every day, on which a dinner was not given to him by some friend elsewhere, and was rarely happy except when so dining. They who have seen him scanning the steward's list of dishes and giving the necessary orders for his own and his friend's dinner at about 4:30 in the afternoon have seen John Vavasor at the only moment of the day at which he is ever much in earnest. All other things are light and easy to him, to be taken easily and to be dismissed easily. Even the eating of the dinner calls forth from him no special sign of energy. Sometimes a frown will gather on his brow as he tastes the first half glass from his bottle of claret, but as a rule, that which he prepared for himself with so much elaborate care is consumed with only pleasant enjoyment. Now and again it will happen that the cook is treacherous even to him, and then he can hit hard. But in hitting he is quiet, and strikes with a smile on his face. Such had been Mr. Vavasor's pursuits and pleasures in life up to that time at which my story commences. But I must not allow the reader to suppose that he is a man without good qualities. Trollope always does this. He describes in detail a man with no good qualities, and then he says, but I shouldn't let you think he had no good qualities. Had he when young possessed the gift of industry, I think he might have shone in his profession, and have been well spoken of and esteemed in the world. As it was, he was a discontented man, but nevertheless he was popular, and to some extent esteemed. He was liberal as far as his means would permit, he was a man of his word, and he understood well that code by which bylaws which was presumed to constitute the character of a gentleman in his circle. He knew how to carry himself well among men, and understood thoroughly what might be said and what might not, what might be done among those with whom he lived, and what should be left undone. By nature, too, he was kindly disposed, loving many persons a little if he loved none or few passionately. Moreover, at the age of 50 he was a handsome man, with a fine forehead, round which the hair and beard were only beginning to show bits of gray. He stood well, with a large person, only now beginning to become corpulent. His eyes were bright and gray, and his mouth and chin were sharply cut, and told of gentle birth. Most men who knew John Vavasor well declared it to be a pity that he should spend his time signing accounts in Chancery Lane. I have said that Alice Vavasor's big relatives cared but little for her in her early years, but I have also said that they were careful to undertake the charge of her education. And I must explain away this little discrepancy. The biggest of these people had hardly ever heard of her, and there was a certain Lady MacLeod, not very big herself, but, as it were, hanging on the skirts of those who were so, who cared very much for Alice. She was the widow of Sir Archibald MacLeod, who had been a soldier, she herself having also been a MacLeod by birth, and for very many years past, from a time previous to the birth of Alice Vavasor, she had lived at Cheltenham, making short journeys into London during the spring when the content of her limited purse would allow of her doing so. So she is poor. She's connected to big people, but she doesn't have money. Lady MacLeod doesn't have money. Of old Lady MacLeod, I think I may say that she was a good woman. All right, well, you'll draw your own conclusions. That she was a good woman, though subject to two of the most serious drawbacks of goodness which can afflict a lady. She was a Calvinistic Sabbatarian in religion, and in worldly matters she was a devout believer in the high rank of her noble relatives. So she's strictly religious and a snob. She could almost worship a youthful marquis, though he lived a life that would disgrace a heathen among the heathens. And she could and did in her own mind condemn crowds of commonplace men and women to all eternal torments which her imagination could conceive because they listened to profane music in a park on a Sunday. Yet she was a good woman. They are honorable men. Out of her small means she gave much away. She owed no man anything. She strove to love her neighbors. She bore much pain with calm, unspeaking endurance, and she lived in trust of a better world. Alice Vavasor, who was, after all, her only her cousin, she loved with exceeding love, and yet Alice had done very much to extinguish such love. Alice, in the years of her childhood, had been brought up by Lady MacLeod. At the age of 12, she had been sent to school in France, a committee of her relatives having agreed that such was to be her fate, much in opposition to Lady MacLeod's judgment, and at 19 she had returned to Cheltenham, and after remaining there for a little more than a year, had expressed her unwillingness to remain longer with her cousin. She could sympathize neither with her relative's faults nor her virtues. She made an arrangement, therefore, with her father that they two would keep house together in London, and so they had lived for the last 5 years. For Alice Vavasor, when she will be introduced to the reader, had already passed her 24th birthday. A little bit older than some of Trollope's heroines, and Lady MacLeod is important because she grew up with Lady MacLeod in place of her mother. Their mode of life had been singular and certainly not in all respects satisfactory. Alice, when she was 21, had full command of her own fortune, and when she induced her father, who for the last 15 years had lived in lodgings, to take a small house in Queen Anne Street, of course she offered to incur a portion of the expense. He had warned her that his habits were not those of a domestic man, but he was content simply to warn her. He had not felt it to be his duty to decline the arrangement because he knew himself to be unable to give his child all the attention which a widowed father under such circumstances should pay to his only daughter. The house had been taken, and Alice and he had lived together, but their lives had been quite apart. For a short time, for a month or two, he had striven to dine at home and even to remain at home through the evening, but the work had been too hard for him, and he had utterly broken down. He had said to her and to himself that his health would fail him under the effects of so great a change made so late in life, and I am not sure that he had not spoken truly. At least he knows how weak and insufficient he is. At any rate, the effort had been abandoned, and Mr. Vavasor now never dined at home. Nor did he and his daughter ever dine out together. Their joint means did not admit of them giving dinners, and therefore they could not make their joint way in the same circle. It thus came to pass that they lived apart, quite apart. They saw each other, probably daily, but they did little more than see each other. They did not even breakfast together, and after 3 o'clock in the day, Mr. Vavasor was never to be found in his own house. Miss Vavasor had made for herself a certain footing in society, though I am disposed to doubt her right to be considered as holding a place among the upper 10,000. 2 classes of people she had chosen to avoid, having been driven to such by avoiding her aunt's preferences. Marquises and such like, whether wicked or otherwise, she had eschewed, and had eschewed likewise all low church tendencies. The eschewing of marquises is not generally very difficult. Young ladies living with their fathers on very moderate incomes in or about Queen Anne Street are not usually much troubled on that matter, nor can I say that Miss Vavasor was so troubled. But with her there was a certain definite thing to be done towards such eschewals. Lady MacLeod by no means avoided her noble relatives, nor did she at all avoid Alice Vavasor. When in London, she was persevering in her visits to Queen Anne Street, though she considered herself, nobody knew why, not to be on speaking terms with Mr. Vavasor. Quite the story there, I bet. And she strove hard to produce an intimacy between Alice and her noble relatives, such an intimacy as that which she herself enjoyed, an intimacy which gave her a footing in their houses, but no footing in their hearts, or even in their habits. Wonderful, just wonderfully put. But all this Alice declined with as much consistency as she did those other struggles with her old cousin made on her behalf. Strong, never flagging, but ever failing efforts to induce the girl to go to such places of worship as Lady Macleod herself frequented. You don't want to go to church with Lady Macleod. A few words must be said as to Alice Vavasor's person. One fact must also be told, and then I believe I may start upon my story. As regards her character, I will leave it to be read in the story itself. We will be reading a good deal of her character. The reader already knows that she appears upon the scene at no very early age, and the mode of her life had perhaps given her an appearance of more years than those which she already possessed. It was not that her face was old, but that there was nothing that was girlish in her manners. Her demeanor was as staid and her voice as self-possessed as though she had already been 10 years married. In person she was tall and well-made, rather large in her neck and shoulders, as were all the Vavasors, but by no means fat. Her hair was brown, very dark, and she wore it rather lower on her forehead than was customary at the present day. Her eyes, too, were dark, though they were not black, and her complexion, though not quite that of a brunette, was far away from being fair. Her nose was somewhat broad, but to my thinking it was a charming nose, full of character, and giving to her face at times a look of pleasant humor, which it would otherwise have lacked. Her mouth was large and full of character, and her chin oval, dimpled, and finely chiseled like her father's. I beg you, in taking her all in all, to admit that she was a fine, handsome, high-spirited young woman. That is not what you have just described, but that's okay. And now for my fact. At the time in which I am writing, she was already engaged to be married. All right, so that is chapter 1 of Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope, where we are introduced to Alice Vavasor and her father. Now, there's a lot that's going to go on in this novel. I don't know how many of you have read this. I don't know how many of you are reading it with me. Last time we did a read-along, a number of you did me the huge honor. I didn't know how good it would feel, of telling me that you were not going to read ahead, that you weren't even going to get the book at all. Several of you didn't even buy a copy of the book. You just said, no, you read it to me. You read it to me. I'm fine with that. To those people, I want to say, Alice Vavasor is old beyond her years. She is mostly brown. Notice how many times brown comes up in that description. Her father is a non-entity. And Lady Macleod is an energetic person, but not very attractive. It's an inauspicious beginning to a long, long novel. It's inauspicious. I want to tell you there's lots more to come, including the character who is the main reason why I picked this book. And any of you who know my history with Trollope will know immediately who that character is. But those of you who don't will find out. I firmly believe that I will not stack the deck. You will end up loving one particular character in this book more than any other. But anyway, that's chapter 1. We will move on next time, and I will see you then. Thank you.